Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The lanterns glow. The moon hung high above the dense forest, casting pale light through the canopy of trees. A gentle wind rustled the leaves, and the air smelled faintly of pine and earth. The group of 5 campers sat around a crackling fire, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the flames. They had been out in the woods for 2 days now, exploring the trails and enjoying the quiet isolation of nature. "You think we should head to bed soon?" Jason asked, poking the fire with a long stick. "I'm good," replied Ella, reclining on her camping chair, her legs stretched out in front of her. "It's a good night to stay up and enjoy the fire. Besides, the rain's coming." They all nodded, knowing that rain was inevitable. The weather had been unpredictable all day, shifting between clear skies and dark clouds, but so far, they had managed to avoid a downpour. "Let's just make sure the tents are secure," said Marcus, the most practical of the group. "The storm's probably going to hit soon." As Marcus began checking the tents, a strange, almost unnoticeable flicker of light caught Jason's eye. He squinted into the dark woods, where shadows stretched long and deep. A faint glow, yellow, like the warm flicker of a candle, was moving slowly through the trees, bobbing just out of his reach. "Hey, you guys see that?" Jason said, his voice low, his gaze still fixed on the glow. Ella and Marcus turned in the direction he was pointing. The others followed suit, and for a moment, the group stared in silence. The glow was unmistakable, a soft light drifting through the trees like a lantern carried by some unseen hand. It was too far to be another camper, and there was no other trail nearby. "Probably just some campers, right?" Ella suggested. "Maybe someone's out there looking for us." "That's a bit far off for anyone to be walking around, though," Jason said, his curiosity piqued. He stood up and started toward the trees. "I'll go check it out," Marcus volunteered. "I'll just take a quick look. It could be a signal from someone." Without waiting for a response, Marcus grabbed a flashlight from his bag and started walking toward the flickering light. Jason, unable to resist the mystery, followed behind. Ella and the others hesitated for a moment, but then stood up, too, grabbing their flashlights and slowly trailing behind the 2 men. The further they ventured into the forest, the fainter the light seemed to grow, yet it remained visible. Jason quickened his pace, his footsteps crunching in the underbrush, while Marcus took more careful steps ahead of him, trying to follow the light's erratic path. "Why is it moving like that?" Ella whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she picked up the pace. "It's like it's moving away from us on purpose. Could just be the wind or something," Jason replied, though even he wasn't convinced. The light seemed to shift with strange intention, like it was drawing them deeper into the woods. They pressed on, the trees thickening as they ventured farther from the campsite. The faint glow was always just a few steps ahead, never allowing them to get any closer. After what felt like an eternity of walking through the dark, damp woods, the group suddenly stopped. The light had stopped moving. It hovered just beyond the trees, behind a large, twisted oak. The air was eerily still now, the only sound the soft drip of water from the leaves above. "I think we've lost it," Marcus muttered. He was panting slightly, his breath visible in the cool night air. "Let's go back." But before they could turn around, the light flickered again, drawing their attention. This time, it stayed in one spot, gently swaying in the wind. There was no mistaking it. It was hanging from a branch. "That's strange," Jason whispered. "Lantern?" "I think so," Marcus said, his voice tense. "But who would leave a lantern out here in the middle of nowhere?" They crept closer, their footsteps soft on the wet ground. As they drew nearer, the flickering flame became clearer. A small lantern, its glass stained and old, hanging from a thick branch. Despite the rain that had started to fall more steadily now, the flame inside the lantern flickered stubbornly, glowing warm and steady. Jason reached out for it, his fingers brushing the cold metal. As soon as he touched the lantern, the air around them seemed to grow colder, the breeze picking up, swirling the fallen leaves around their feet. The faintest whisper seemed to echo from the trees, like a breath on the wind. Then, as if on cue, dark shadows seemed to emerge from the edges of the trees. The whispers grew louder, clearer, as though a voice was calling out to them, beckoning. "Get away from the lantern." The voice was low, raspy, barely more than a murmur. But it sent a chill down Jason's spine. Ella froze, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" "Who's there?" Marcus called, his voice wavering. The shadows around them shifted, dark forms swirling with a life of their own. There were no figures they could see, only darkness that seemed to grow thicker, darker, as though it was gathering around them. The whispers came again, now more distinct, more frantic. "Leave now. Go back to the fire." The lantern's flame flickered violently, casting long, unsettling shadows across the forest floor. For a moment, the light seemed to flare bright enough to almost blind them, then dimmed again, leaving them standing in an eerie twilight of darkness. Jason's breath came in short gasps. "We need to get out of here." But as he turned to go, the shadows closed in around them, and the whispers grew louder, more demanding. They swirled around the group like a suffocating fog. "Why are you here?" one voice hissed. "We can't leave until you understand," another whispered. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the rain began to fall harder, drenching them in seconds. The lantern's flame burned brighter, and with it, the shadows seemed to grow more aggressive, circling the group, their forms shifting unnaturally. Jason's heart raced as panic set in. They couldn't move fast enough. The whispers were everywhere now, echoing off the trees, filling his head, drowning out all reason. "Get away from it," Marcus shouted, yanking Jason away from the lantern. He stumbled back, pulling Ella along with him. The shadows seemed to retreat just enough for them to escape. They ran. The forest, once eerily quiet, now felt alive with the presence of something watching, something that didn't want them to leave. As they sprinted back toward the campsite, the whispers followed, fading only when they crossed the threshold of the firelight. They collapsed at the edge of the campsite, gasping for breath, their hearts racing in terror. The fire crackled warmly in front of them, but the forest beyond was silent again. What the hell was that? Jason breathed, looking over at Marcus and Ella. I don't know, Marcus said, his face pale, but I'm not going back out there. The group sat in stunned silence, their eyes darting nervously to the edge of the camp, where the forest seemed to loom, darker than before. The lantern's glow still haunted their thoughts, the whispers echoing faintly in their minds. As the rain began to fall harder, drowning out the sounds of the forest, the group realized they would never forget the strange light and the shadows that danced around it, nor would they ever again feel entirely safe in the woods. The end. Story 2. The Forgotten Campsite. The forest seemed to stretch on forever. As Marcus walked deeper into the woods, the trees grew taller, the underbrush thicker, and the trail less defined. He had ventured off the main path in search of a new route, hoping to find a secluded spot by the lake for the night. The air had a heavy, damp scent, the kind that lingers after a fresh rainstorm, and the leaves crunched softly beneath his boots as he trudged onward. Hours had passed since he had last seen any sign of human life. No more hikers, no more distant road sounds, just the deep silence of the forest. The further he went, the more isolated he felt. Yet there was something oddly comforting about the stillness, a quiet that settled into his bones. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the weight of the isolation grew heavier. He checked his watch, almost 6:30 p.m. With nightfall quickly approaching, Marcus knew he needed to find shelter before it got too dark. He decided to head in the direction of a small clearing he had passed earlier. But as he turned a corner of dense trees, something unexpected caught his attention, a faint flicker of light. He stopped, squinting into the growing darkness, unsure whether it was his imagination playing tricks on him. The light was soft but unmistakable, the orange glow of a fire. Curious, he approached cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the forest floor. He pushed through a thick patch of ferns and emerged into a small, open area. There, in the middle of the clearing, was an abandoned campsite. A fire pit, still smoldering with a faint trace of smoke, sat in the center. Around it were scattered remnants of an old campsite, a couple of tents, sleeping bags, a kettle, and some cooking equipment. The place looked as though it had been hastily abandoned, the gear strewn about as though the campers had just left without packing up. Marcus's curiosity piqued. There was no sign of anyone around, but the fire was still warm, and the kettle sitting by the flames looked like it had been used recently. He felt a strange pull to investigate further. Maybe he could find something useful, perhaps a map or a flashlight that had been forgotten in the haste of leaving. He squatted near the fire pit, poking at the glowing embers with a stick. The fire's warmth washed over him, but the coldness of the surrounding forest was beginning to creep into his bones. As he glanced around, he noticed that there was no sign of disturbance, no footprints or recent signs of movement around the campsite. It seemed as though the campers had vanished without a trace. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't entirely alone. He stood up, scanning the trees and the perimeter of the clearing. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the forest. Perhaps it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but something about the campsite felt wrong. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as a gust of wind passed through the trees, making the branches sway and creak ominously. Deciding to make the most of the situation, Marcus took out his small tent and set it up near the fire. He figured he would wait out the night and try to find his way back to the trail in the morning. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness enveloped the woods, an unsettling quiet fell over the campsite. No animal sounds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of his own breathing and the crackling of the fire. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames as the night stretched on. A deep sense of loneliness settled in his chest, the quiet oppressive, as though the forest itself was watching him. The shadows seemed to move at the edges of his vision, but every time he looked, there was nothing there. Then, just as he was starting to drift into a half-sleep, he heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, a voice carried on the wind, barely audible. His eyes snapped open. He strained to hear, convinced it was just his imagination. But no, there it was again, a whisper, almost too soft to make out, but unmistakable. Help! The voice was distant, but it clearly wasn't his own. His heart skipped a beat. The fire crackled louder, as if in response to the chill that suddenly gripped the air. He jumped to his feet, his eyes darting around the clearing. There was no one in sight. The whispering continued, growing slightly clearer with each passing second. Help come, find us. Marcus's pulse quickened. He took a few cautious steps toward the edge of the campsite, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The forest around him felt alive, the shadows stretching unnaturally, and the wind began to pick up, rustling the trees. The whispers turned into soft murmurs, like a conversation just out of reach. "Who's there?" Marcus called, his voice shaking slightly. There was no response, just the soft crackling of the fire and the wind stirring the leaves. He swallowed hard, his instincts telling him to leave, but something deep within him kept him rooted to the spot. The whispers were becoming more insistent, the voices almost pleading. He stepped back to the fire, his mind racing. The firelight danced on the ground, casting long shadows on the trees around him. The wind picked up again, and he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching softly in the dry leaves behind him. Marcus spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The clearing was empty, but the sound of footsteps continued, as if someone or something was circling him just outside the edge of the firelight. He gripped the flashlight tighter, his heart thudding in his chest. Another gust of wind, and then a soft voice whispered in his ear, as though right behind him, "Don't leave." Marcus froze. He could feel the cold breath on the back of his neck. Without thinking, he grabbed his things and bolted toward his tent, slamming the zipper shut behind him. He tried to steady his breathing, his mind racing. The whispers faded into the night, but the footsteps continued to echo in his mind. Hours passed in restless fear, the wind howling outside his tent, the footsteps never truly fading. He kept his flashlight on, but it felt useless, a small, fragile beam in the vastness of the dark woods. His thoughts kept returning to the abandoned campsite, the unease he had felt, the sense that something wasn't right. By the time dawn began to break, the whispers had stopped. The forest was eerily silent again, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. Marcus emerged from his tent, his body sore from the tense night. He half expected to see the campsite as it had been the night before, but when he stepped out, he was stunned. The fire pit was gone. The kettle, the sleeping bags, and the tents had all vanished as if they had never been there. The forest was unchanged, but there was no sign of the campsite, no trace that anyone had ever been there. He searched the area, but there was nothing, just the same empty wilderness that had surrounded him since his arrival. Marcus stood in the clearing, his heart racing. He looked around, half expecting to see someone watching him, but there was nothing, no sign of life, no indication of what had happened. The voices, the footsteps, the presence of the campers. It was as if they had all been a figment of his imagination, a dream born of the isolation of the woods. But deep down, Marcus knew it wasn't a dream. He had heard those whispers. He had felt the presence of something or someone lingering just beyond his sight. He turned and walked away, his footsteps slow and deliberate, the silence of the forest pressing in on him like a heavy weight. He didn't look back. He didn't want to. The forest was not as empty as it seemed. The end. Story 3. The Screaming Trees. The campfire crackled and popped, sending a few embers spiraling into the night air. The scent of burning would mix with the fresh pine smell of the forest, the warm orange glow of the flames casting shadows on the faces of the group huddled around it. There were 6 of them, friends from university who had decided to take a break from their busy lives and spend the weekend camping in the woods. It was supposed to be a fun, carefree trip, a way to disconnect from technology and reconnect with nature. But the forest around them had an eerie quality, something they couldn't quite put their finger on. The night was still, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. But something about the silence felt off. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide as she glanced around the dark forest. She had always been sensitive to the sounds of nature, and tonight, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Hear what?" Ryan, who was sitting next to her, asked, his voice teasing. He had always been the skeptic in the group, dismissing anything strange as just a figment of someone's imagination. "Listen," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "There's something out there." It sounded like screaming. The others fell silent, their eyes turning toward the dark trees at the edge of the campsite. At first, there was nothing but the soft crackle of the fire. Then, faintly, almost drowned out by the wind, they heard it, a high-pitched sound, shrill and unnatural. It was like a scream, distant but distinct, echoing through the trees. "Probably just an animal," Mark said with a shrug, trying to sound casual. "Maybe a fox or a coyote. They can make some pretty weird noises." "But it sounded different," Sarah insisted, her voice shaking slightly. "It sounded like a person." Ryan laughed. "You're hearing things. Come on, it's just the wind playing tricks." The group fell into an uneasy silence, each of them trying to convince themselves that it was nothing. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the ground, the wind whispering through the trees. But the scream came again, this time louder, sharper, and more desperate. It echoed through the woods, piercing the stillness of the night like a knife. "I'm going to check it out," Mark said, suddenly standing up. He had always been the brave one, the one who liked to prove that he wasn't scared of anything. The others protested, but he just waved them off. "Don't be ridiculous," Ryan called after him. "It's nothing, just some animal." But Mark was already heading into the woods, his flashlight cutting a narrow beam of light through the darkness. The others watched in silence, their eyes trained on the tree lean, waiting for him to return. As he disappeared into the shadows, the air grew heavier. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and making the trees groan and creak as though they were alive. The sound of the distant scream came again, but this time it was followed by something else, something worse. A low, guttural growl echoed from the forest, so deep and ominous that it seemed to vibrate in their bones. The group froze, their breath catching in their throats. They had never heard anything like it before. It wasn't the cry of an animal, nor the sound of wind. It was something darker, something older. "Mark," Sarah called, her voice trembling. There was no response. "Mark," she called again, rising to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. "Stay here," Ryan said, his voice firm. "I'll go get him." But as he stood up, another scream rent the air, a scream so tortured, so full of anguish, that it made them all freeze. It was unmistakably human, and it sounded so close that they all felt the hairs on the back of their necks rise in terror. "Ryan!" Sarah cried, but Ryan was already moving toward the woods, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. The rest of the group stood together by the fire, fear tightening their chests as they waited, hoping the sound of Ryan's footsteps would return soon. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, the distant glow of Ryan's flashlight emerged from the tree line. But something was wrong. His movements were jerky, his steps uneven. He looked unnerved. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp with anxiety. She took a step forward, but Ryan held up a hand, signaling for her to stay back. "Don't come," he said, his voice strained. You won't believe what I saw." "What did you see?" Mark asked, his face pale as he approached cautiously. Ryan's eyes were wide, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I don't know," he muttered. "I think it was them. The trees. The trees." Sarah repeated, confusion and fear battling for control of her voice. "They weren't just trees," Ryan said, his eyes darting nervously to the woods behind them. "The branches, they looked like faces. Twisted, contorted faces like they were screaming. I couldn't get away fast enough." "What are you talking about?" Mark asked, shaking his head, clearly not believing him. "There's nothing out there." Ryan swallowed hard, his body trembling. "You have to go see for yourselves. Don't go into the woods, though. Don't get too close." The others were silent for a long moment, the crackle of the fire the only sound in the air. Then, without a word, they all turned to look toward the woods. The wind had died down, and the forest was still once more. "Let's go," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "Let's see what he saw." The group slowly ventured into the woods, the trees looming high above them, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the ground. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the silence became. They could hear nothing but their own breathing, nothing but the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. Then, just as they were about to give up and turn back, they saw it, a faint glow between the trunks of the trees. It was soft at first, like a distant lantern light, but as they moved closer, it grew brighter, more intense, until it was almost blinding. And then they saw them, the trees, the twisted, gnarled trees that Ryan had spoken of. Their branches reached out like skeletal fingers, their bark scarred and peeling. But what struck them most were the faces. At first, they thought it was just the patterns of the bark, the way the knots and scars have formed in strange, unsettling ways. But then they realized they were faces, faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes hollow and unblinking. The group froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. They couldn't look away, couldn't tear their eyes from the trees. The faces seemed to move, as if they were alive, as if they were reaching out to them, begging them to listen, to understand. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves and making the trees groan as though they were alive. The whispers came then, soft, sibilant whispers that carried on the wind. Leave now." But the group couldn't move. They were rooted to the spot, trapped in the forest with the agonized faces of the trees surrounding them. The screams, faint at first, began to grow louder, sharper, until they were deafening, ringing in their ears. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The forest went still again. The trees were silent. The faces were gone. The glow faded, and the woods seemed to return to normal. But none of them could shake the feeling that something was still watching them. Something ancient, something hungry. "Let's go," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Without a word, they turned and ran back to the campsite, the distant sound of the wind and the whispers still echoing in their minds. When they reached the fire, they didn't look back. They couldn't. They sat in silence, huddled together, the weight of the night pressing down on them. The next morning, they packed up their things and left, never speaking of what they had seen. But they all knew they could never forget the faces in the trees, and the whispers still haunted their dreams. The end. Story 4. The Midnight Visitor. The night was cool and clear, the kind of night that made the stars sparkle like scattered diamonds in the sky. A gentle breeze ruffled the leaves of the trees surrounding the small campsite, and the sound of crickets and distant owls filled the air. The group of friends, 5 of them, all excited for a weekend of camping by the lake, had settled around the campfire. They were far from the bustling city, surrounded by the quiet wilderness, and they relished the peace it brought. They had arrived at the campsite earlier in the day, setting up tents near the water's edge. The lake was calm, its surface reflecting the moonlight like a mirror. The sky above them stretched wide, as if to remind them just how small they were in the grand scheme of things. It was the perfect place to escape, and they'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. "All right, no phones, no distractions," said Ethan, one of the more enthusiastic members of the group. "Let's enjoy the night, just like the old days." Everyone laughed and nodded in agreement. They spent the evening cooking over the fire, telling stories, and roasting marshmallows. As the night wore on, the laughter slowly faded, and one by one, they crawled into their tents, exhausted but content. It was well past midnight when the first sound pierced the silence, a soft, melodic whistling. It was faint at first, just a few notes carried by the wind, but soon it became louder, more distinct. The gentle notes of the whistle seemed to float across the water, echoing through the woods and seeping into the tents. Lena, who was lying in her sleeping bag, was the first to hear it. She stirred, blinking in confusion as she tried to place the sound. Whistling? At this hour? She sat up and listened, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. The whistling came again, clearer now, slow, deliberate, and hauntingly beautiful. It sounded close, too close. Did anyone else hear that? Lena whispered to her tent mates. "What?" Ethan mumbled groggily from the next tent. "It's probably just the wind or something." Lena wasn't so sure. The whistling sounded like it was coming from just outside their tents, like someone was standing there, almost right next to them. Her skin prickled with unease. "Is someone messing with us?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't think so," said Jake, the most practical of the group, who was already sitting up and listening intently. "We're out here in the middle of nowhere. No one else is around for miles." The whistling came again, and this time it was unmistakably closer. It was so clear now that Lena could hear the soft shift of the breeze as it carried the notes. Her breath caught in her throat. There was no mistaking it. It was a person, but where were they? "I'm going to check it out," Jake said, pushing aside his blanket and unzipping his tent. The others hesitated but didn't stop him. Jake stepped into the cool night air, the moon casting a soft glow over the lake. The water shimmered like liquid silver, and the trees stood in eerie stillness. He glanced around, trying to spot whoever might be out there, but the camp was empty. The only sound now was the soft lapping of the lake against the shore. "Hello," Jake called out, his voice carrying across the open space. But the only response was the continued whistling, now louder, but still unseen. "Who's there?" Jake called again, his voice tinged with annoyance. He was starting to feel foolish. It had to be one of the others, playing some kind of prank. But the whistling didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, more urgent, the melody carrying on the wind, swirling around him like it was teasing him. Then, without warning, the whistling stopped. There was an eerie silence. Jake turned around, scanning the area, but there was still no one in sight. "Did you hear that?" Ethan's voice came from behind him, and Jake spun around, his heart racing. Ethan was standing at the edge of the camp, his flashlight in hand. "Yeah, but there's no one here," Jake said, his voice low. "Well, I'm not staying out here alone," Ethan said quickly, turning back toward the campsite. "Let's get back inside." Jake nodded, his unease growing. They both hurried back toward the tents, but as they did, the whistling started again, this time much closer. It was as if whoever was whistling had moved just behind them, but when they spun around, they saw nothing. The sound was haunting now, a strange, eerie melody that sent shivers down their spines. It was so close, yet there was nothing to see. No figures, no shadows, just the stillness of the woods. "Do you think it's someone playing a prank?" Jake whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "It's not funny anymore," Ethan replied, his voice shaky. "Who would be out here at this hour, whistling like that? Maybe it's an animal or something," Jake suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. He had lived in the woods long enough to know that animals didn't whistle. Lena, who had been listening from inside the tent, was starting to feel a rising sense of panic. She unzipped her tent and stepped out into the cold night, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. "Do you see anything?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," Ethan answered. "Nothing." But the whistling, it didn't stop. It continued, now a swirling, ghostly melody that drifted through the trees, weaving in and out like it was taunting them. It wasn't just whistling anymore. It was almost as if someone was singing in a strange, haunting tune, a melody that seemed to echo from all around them. "We need to leave," Lena said, her voice low but firm. "This isn't right." Suddenly, the whistling stopped again. For a moment, everything was still, the only sound the soft rustle of the leaves in the breeze. Then, just as they were about to turn back to their tents, the whistling began again, this time from behind them. "Run!" Jake shouted, and without a second thought, they all bolted toward the lake, away from the campsite. The sound of their frantic footsteps drowned out the whistling as they reached the water's edge. their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The moonlight shimmered on the lake, casting a soft, silvery glow over the still surface. The night felt suffocating, heavy with tension. The whistling came again, but this time it was softer, like a whisper across the water. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was gone. The group stood there for a long moment, staring at the dark forest behind them. Not a sound was left except for the faint lapping of the water at their feet. "We need to get out of here," Lena said, her voice shaking. "No arguments from me," Ethan said quickly, his eyes still darting nervously around. "Let's pack up and go." The night stretched on, but the sound of the whistling never returned. Still, the group couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching them from the shadows. By morning, they had packed up and left the campsite behind, but none of them spoke of the events that had occurred. They couldn't explain it, and they didn't want to. They simply wanted to forget. But as they drove back to the city, the memory of the haunting whistle stayed with them, echoing in their minds like an unanswered question. The end. Story 5. The Silent Forest. The morning light filtered softly through the trees, casting long, dappled shadows on the forest floor. Birds, as usual, were singing their early songs, and the wind rustled gently through the leaves, bringing with it the sweet scent of pine and earth. But as Sarah slowly stirred in her sleeping bag, something felt off. It was quiet, unusually quiet. She blinked, her eyes still heavy with sleep, listening carefully. No birds chirped, no insects hummed. The usual background noise of the forest, the lively symphony of nature, was gone. It was as though the entire forest had fallen into a deep, unnatural silence. Sarah pushed herself up, her mind still foggy from sleep. She glanced over at her friends' tents, half expecting to hear the usual sounds of them stirring as well. But there was nothing, not a sound, not a movement. She felt a strange unease creep up her spine, but she shook it off as just the remnants of a vivid dream. Still, the silence gnawed at her. "Guys," she called, her voice tentative in the still air. "Wake up. It's a beautiful morning." No response. She unzipped her tent and stepped outside, the cool morning air hitting her skin like a refreshing wave. But the silence was overwhelming. It clung to the woods like a thick fog, suffocating everything around her. Her breath seemed too loud in the stillness, and her footsteps on the soft earth echoed in her ears as she walked toward the campfire. It was still cold and unlit, untouched by the usual morning hustle of starting a fire. "Okay, this is getting weird," Sarah muttered under her breath. Her eyes scanned the surrounding forest, searching for something, anything, that could explain this eerie stillness. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their trunks straight and tall, their leaves unmoving. She could see no signs of life, no birds fluttering through the branches, no squirrels darting between the underbrush, nothing. Even the usual chirping of insects was absent. And then her gaze was drawn to something else, something strange. The trees, which had once seemed so inviting, now appeared marked, disturbed. She took a few hesitant steps toward the nearest tree and squatted down to inspect it. Deep, jagged claw marks scored the bark, gouging the wood in long, violent streaks. They weren't just scratches. They were almost as if something had raked its claws down the entire length of the trunk with unnatural force. The markings seemed fresh, though they weren't dripping sap, which struck Sarah as odd. And the more she looked, the more she noticed the same markings on other trees, scattered throughout the clearing and the surrounding woods. Her heart began to race, a sharp jolt of fear surging through her. There was something wrong here, something unnatural. But what? As she stood up and looked around again, the silence deepened, and she felt as if the forest itself was holding its breath, watching her. She shivered, despite the warmth of the sun, and took a few steps back toward her tent. But before she could turn around, a strange sound broke the silence. A whisper. It was faint at first, like the rustling of wind through the trees. But there was no breeze. No leaves moved. And then the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't in any language Sarah could understand, but it was there, floating just at the edge of her hearing, as if something was calling to her from deep within the woods. Her pulse quickened, and her instinct told her to run, but her feet remained rooted to the ground, as though the forest itself had ensnared her. She scanned the trees, her eyes wide with fear, but saw nothing, only the strange claw marks and the whispers. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" The whispers stopped abruptly. The silence returned, even more oppressive than before. A low, rumbling sound reached her ears, and she turned toward the noise. It came from the direction of the deeper forest, just beyond the trees where the underbrush thickened. At first, it sounded like the wind picking up, but there was no wind, no movement in the trees. Then she heard it, a soft, shuffling sound like something large moving through the forest. It was unmistakable now. Something was out there, and it was coming closer. Sarah's heart raced in her chest, and she took a cautious step back, her eyes scanning the woods. The whispers had returned, louder now, circling around her like an invisible storm. They seemed to come from all directions, soft and insistent, urging her to listen. But what were they saying? Suddenly, a shadow passed through the trees, large and quick. It was only a glimpse, a dark figure darting between the trunks, but it was enough to freeze Sarah in place. Her breath caught in her throat as her body tensed with fear. Her first instinct was to run, to turn and sprint back to the safety of the camp and her friends. But as she glanced over her shoulder, she realized that no one was coming. Her friends were still in their tents, and the eerie silence had swallowed up all the usual sounds of their movements. They hadn't heard the whispers, the scratching on the trees, or the shuffling sound that was still growing louder. They were oblivious, caught in some other world where everything was normal, while she was standing on the edge of something terrifying. The shadows in the trees shifted again, moving closer, but still nothing revealed itself. Sarah could feel the presence, though. Something was watching her, waiting. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she slowly turned toward the woods. That was when she saw it. From behind the trees, just barely visible through the thick trunks, a pair of glowing eyes appeared. They were distant at first, but slowly they moved toward her, their light piercing through the dense underbrush. As they came closer, the shape of a figure began to take form, tall, dark, and impossibly still. Its presence felt ancient, like something that had been lurking in the forest for centuries. The whispers grew louder now, as if urging her to flee, to leave the woods behind before it was too late. But her feet were frozen to the ground. The figure, if it could be called that, was closing in on her, and she had no idea what it was or what it wanted. Then, as if the universe had decided to grant her mercy, Sarah snapped back to reality. She turned and ran, her legs moving faster than they ever had before. She bolted toward the campsite, her heart pounding, the sound of her breath ragged in her ears. But even as she ran, she could still hear the whispers following her, just on the edge of hearing. Sarah, Sarah. She didn't look back, but when she reached her tent, she quickly zipped it up and crawled inside, breathing heavily. The whispers stopped. The eyes vanished. The shadow melted into the trees, leaving her trembling and alone in the cold silence of the tent. For the rest of the day, Sarah stayed hidden in her tent, too terrified to go outside. Her friends finally woke up, none the wiser to the horrors she had just experienced. They laughed, joked, and prepared breakfast, completely unaware of the evil that had watched them in the night. As the day stretched on, the forest slowly returned to its normal sounds. The chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, the hum of insects in the air. But Sarah knew. She knew that something was still out there, hidden in the silence of the woods. And she knew, with chilling certainty, that it would never leave. The end. Story 6. The camper who never left. The campfire crackled and popped, its warm glow flickering in the dark woods. The air was crisp, the smell of pine and damp earth filling their lungs as they sat in a circle on logs, wrapped in the stillness of the night. The stars twinkled above them, bright and distant, as if watching over the small group of friends who had ventured deep into the wilderness for their weekend camping trip. Ben, the most outspoken of the group, leaned forward, his face lit by the firelight. "Have you guys heard the story of the camper who disappeared?" he asked, his voice low, but with a mischievous edge. The others turned toward him, intrigued, their eyes reflecting the dance of the flames. Ben was always the one to share local legends, stories that had a way of making the most normal evening feel eerie, even on the clearest nights. But tonight, as the wind rustled through the trees and the shadows crept closer, the mood seemed to shift, just enough for the tale to settle into their minds with an unsettling weight. "Tell us, Sarah," one of the group said with a smile. though she had already begun to look around at the surrounding trees as if something might be lurking just beyond the fire's light. Ben leaned back, his face taking on the air of someone about to share a dark secret. It happened about 10 years ago, he began, his voice dropping even lower. A camper, a guy named James. He was out here, just like us, enjoying the woods, hiking around and taking in the peace and quiet. But one night, something changed. He went to sleep, just like we did, and the next morning he was gone. The group exchanged looks. Gone? Ethan, the quiet one of the group, asked. Like, just vanished? Exactly, Ben said, nodding. His tent was still standing. His gear was neatly packed. His campfire was still warm, like he'd just left for a moment and would come back. But the strange part, there were his boots right outside his tent. Wet, muddy, as if someone had just taken them off and left them behind. No sign of James. No tracks leading away. Nothing. The group fell silent. The crackling of the fire the only sound in the dark woods. The wind seemed to pick up, brushing against the trees like a whisper. Sarah shivered, wrapping her arms tighter around herself. Ben continued, his tone becoming more serious. They searched for days, the whole area. They never found anything, no body, no sign of struggle. But the boots were still there when they finally left, and to this day, no one knows what happened to him. Some people say he got lost. Some say he was taken. And others, well, they say something in these woods claimed him. Something that never lets go of anyone who stays too long. Sarah's laugh was nervous, but she couldn't help herself. Come on, Ben. You're not trying to spook us, are you? She said, though the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her attempt at bravado. The firelight flickered across her face as she looked at the dark woods around them. Ben shrugged, his eyes glinting with the thrill of the story. Who knows? Maybe it's just a legend, but people around here still talk about it. Every now and then, some hiker disappears, and the boots are always found. Wet, muddy, just like James were. A deep silence fell over the group, the weight of the tale settling over them. Even the crackle of the fire seemed muted now, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. After a long moment, Sarah shook her head, trying to brush off the unease creeping up her spine. All right, let's not get all spooky on this trip, she said, forcing a laugh. We're here to have fun, not get freaked out. The group nodded in agreement, but no one really seemed to be able to shake off the tension that had settled into the air. They finished their conversation, talking about other things, but the shadows seemed to grow longer, the trees pressing in just a little bit closer. As the night wore on, they decided it was time to go to bed. The fire's light dimmed as they retreated to their tents, the darkness enveloping them. The sounds of the forest, the calls of owls, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, began to fade as they zipped up their tents and crawled into their sleeping bags. Sarah lay awake for a long time, staring at the dark ceiling of her tent. Her mind kept returning to the boots. Wet, muddy, left behind. It didn't make sense, and yet, the more she thought about it, the more uneasy she became. She tried to shake it off, closing her eyes and telling herself that Ben was just telling a tall tale. But sleep didn't come easily. The wind outside picked up again, shaking the tent walls gently, and Sarah finally drifted off into a restless slumber. It was hours later when she woke up, her eyes snapping open in the darkness. At first, she wasn't sure why she was awake, but then she heard it. The sound of something scraping lightly against the fabric of her tent. Her heart leapt in her chest. It was as if someone was standing outside, pressing up against the tent, moving slowly and deliberately. She held her breath, listening, her mind racing. Was it an animal? Or was it something else? She was frozen in place, unable to move, her thoughts spinning in panic. The sound stopped suddenly. A long, tense silence followed, and then Sarah heard a noise outside her tent, faint at first, but unmistakable. The slow, deliberate sound of boots stepping in the wet mud. A cold chill ran down her spine as the unmistakable image of muddy boots, just like in Ben's story, flashed in her mind. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but the sound of the boots grew louder, moving closer to her tent. The faint thud of the wet soles against the ground seemed to reverberate through the very fabric of the tent, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. She felt paralyzed, trapped in her own fear. The boots stopped, right outside her tent. Sarah held her breath, waiting. Every sound seemed amplified. The pounding of her heart, the faint rustle of the trees in the distance, and the sudden, sharp intake of her breath. The quiet, aching silence stretched on, and for a long moment, she wondered if she had imagined it all. But then, with a soft, almost imperceptible movement, the tent zipper on her door slowly began to unzip. Her pulse raced. She fought the urge to scream, to shout for her friends. But somehow, she couldn't move. She lay there, completely still, staring at the zipper, which continued to inch open, bit by bit. The sound of the zipper seemed impossibly loud in the oppressive silence. Just as the zipper reached the bottom of the door, the zipper stopped. The boots were still outside, and the silence was suffocating. And then, without warning, the soft scrape of the boots against the ground resumed. Step, step, step. The boots were moving away from her tent, slowly but steadily, as though someone had been standing right there, waiting. Sarah waited, her body tense, unsure whether she should move or stay still. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped altogether. Minutes passed, and the night's silence seemed to fall even deeper. She couldn't bring herself to move. She couldn't bring herself to look outside. The next morning, Sarah awoke to a chilling sight. As she stepped outside her tent, she saw them. Wet, muddy boots, placed carefully just at the edge of her tent flap. There was no sign of anyone. No footsteps leading away. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked around at her friends, who were still asleep, unaware of what had happened in the night. But Sarah knew. The camper who never left hadn't gone anywhere. And now, the boots had come for her. The end. Story 7. The shadow at the edge of the firelight. The flames crackled and popped, sending occasional sparks dancing into the cold night air. The group of friends sat huddled around the campfire, their faces illuminated by the warm glow as they shared stories of their childhoods, personal victories, and, inevitably, creepy tales of the dark woods around them. The forest was alive with sounds, the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves as a light breeze swept through the trees. It was the perfect night for camping, or so they thought. Emma was the first to notice it. She had been laughing at a funny story Mark had just told, a tale of a disastrous fishing trip, when she glanced over her shoulder. For a brief moment, just beyond the flickering light of the fire, she saw something, a shape, something standing just out of sight, hidden in the shadows. She blinked, convinced it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But when she looked again, the figure was still there. Tall, dark, a silhouette against the dense woods that seemed unnaturally still. Did anyone else see that? Emma asked, her voice unsteady. The others stopped talking, their laughter fading into an uncomfortable silence. Mark was the first to look around, followed by Sophie and Ben, but no one said anything at first. The woods were vast, and shadows were a natural part of the night, right? It could just be a trick of the firelight, they all told themselves. But the longer they stared, the more they realized it wasn't just a trick. I think I saw something too, Ben said, his voice quiet, almost as if speaking too loudly might disturb whatever was out there. Look, he pointed in the direction Emma had been staring, and everyone turned their gaze toward the edge of the firelight. At first, the figure appeared to be nothing more than a distortion in the darkness, a shadow cast by one of the surrounding trees, perhaps. But as they all focused, they realized the shape didn't quite fit with the natural surroundings. It wasn't a tree or a bush. It was taller, more humanoid, and it didn't sway or move in the way wind-blown branches did. It was as still as stone. "What is that?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling just a little. The figure remained unmoving, no matter how long they stared. It seemed to be watching them, standing just out of the reach of the firelight. The crackling flames painted brief, fleeting shadows on the trees around them, but the figure remained untouched by the light, staying exactly where it was, just beyond the illumination. Emma's heart began to race. "It's not moving," she whispered, her breath catching in her throat. "Why isn't it moving?" Mark shifted uncomfortably on his log, reaching for his flashlight. "Let's check it out," he said, trying to sound confident. "Maybe it's a person, maybe it's a prank." But as he turned on the flashlight and aimed it toward the dark spot, the light hit the spot where the shadow had been standing, but there was nothing there. The beam of light revealed only a tangle of branches and the empty clearing beyond the firelight. Everyone's breath caught in their throats. It was as though the figure had disappeared into thin air. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, Ben suggested, his voice wavering. You know, shadows can play weird tricks. But Emma wasn't convinced. She had seen it too clearly. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just a trick of the fire. She glanced back at the others, and the tension in the air was thick. Just as the group began to relax, convincing themselves that it was nothing, they heard something. A faint rustle in the underbrush, followed by a soft, uneven shuffle. The sound of something moving toward them. Sophie's eyes widened, and she gripped Emma's arm tightly. Did you hear that? Everyone sat still, holding their breath, listening. The sound came again, a slow shuffle, followed by a slight rustling of leaves. But they couldn't see what it was. The figure was back. There it was, once again standing at the edge of the firelight. It hadn't moved any closer, but it hadn't moved away either. It stood there, as if waiting, watching, silent. Okay, this is getting weird, Mark said, his voice tight. He stood up slowly and aimed his flashlight at the shadow, trying to pierce the darkness. But the beam of light didn't touch the figure. It seemed to stop just short, as if something was preventing it from revealing what was truly there. The shadow remained as dark and solid as ever, even as the flashlight beam shined right at it. Ben grabbed the flashlight from Mark, shining it from a different angle. But again, the figure remained just beyond the reach of the light. No matter where they aimed it, no matter how far they adjusted, it stayed exactly the same distance away from them. Why won't it come closer? Sophie whispered, her voice laced with fear. Emma could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. She wanted to move, to run, but something held her in place. The figure never advanced. It never moved. It just watched. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, colder, as though the very atmosphere was charged with an eerie energy. The rustling sound in the trees had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed in on them from all sides. Finally, Ben couldn't take it anymore. With a shaky breath, he grabbed the nearest stick and hurled it toward the figure, trying to disrupt whatever it was that stood there. The stick sailed through the air and landed just before the figure, but to everyone's horror, it seemed to pass right through it, as if the shadow were made of smoke. The stick landed in the dirt with a soft thud, and the figure remained untouched. That thing's not real, Ben muttered, his eyes wide. But even as he said it, the words fell hollow. The fire flickered violently, casting strange shadows in all directions, and for a split second, the group swore the figure's shape had shifted. It wasn't human anymore. It was something else. The silhouette seemed to grow, stretching unnaturally tall, its edges distorting like smoke in the wind. Sophie screamed and bolted to her feet, and the others scrambled to their feet as well, their hearts pounding in their chests. Go! Go! Mark shouted, grabbing his backpack, but as they turned to run, the figure was there, right in front of them. It had closed the gap. Emma froze in place. The shadow had moved closer, but still, it was not quite in the light. Its form loomed over them, an oppressive presence, blocking their escape. "Run!" Ben yelled, but no one moved. It was as if the shadow had frozen them in place, rooted to the ground with a force they couldn't understand. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow retreated. The figure moved back into the darkness, leaving them all breathless and trembling. They didn't wait for another moment. Without a word, they grabbed their things and ran in the opposite direction, away from the fire, away from the shadow. As they ran, they dared not look back, not even once. They just ran until they were well out of sight of the campfire, their hearts racing and their lungs burning from the exertion. When they finally stopped, panting, and turned back to the camp, the fire was out. The clearing was empty. No sign of the shadow. No trace of what had happened. Only the quiet darkness of the forest remained. But the eerie feeling stayed with them. The night seemed colder, darker, and the woods, they felt alive in a way they never had before. Something was watching just beyond the light, and it hadn't left. The end. Story 8. The Whispering Stream. It was a perfect night for camping. The group of friends, for in total, had ventured deep into the woods, seeking peace and a break from the noise of their everyday lives. After a day of hiking, they set up their tents beside a gently babbling brook, the sound of water flowing over smooth rocks filling the air like a natural lullaby. The forest around them was alive with the evening chorus of crickets, and the stars above glimmered through the gaps in the canopy, casting a silver glow over the campsite. By all accounts, it was the kind of night that promised restful sleep and peaceful dreams. But the stream, with its quiet whispers, had other plans. As the group settled around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories, the sound of the water grew louder, becoming more pronounced as the night deepened. At first, it was comforting, a gentle background hum that only added to the peaceful atmosphere of the woods. The fire crackled in front of them, and the occasional owl hooted from the trees. But then, as the night pressed on and the fire burned lower, something strange happened. Sophie, the quietest of the group, was the first to notice. She had been gazing into the fire, lost in thought, when she realized the sound of the stream was changing. It had started as the soft murmur of water trickling over rocks, but now it seemed different. It was still water, yes, but there was something else in it, something almost human. "Hey guys," she started, her voice trembling slightly. "What's up?" Ben asked, glancing up from his roasting stick. "I don't know," Sophie said, brow furrowed. "The stream, it sounds different." "What do you mean?" Mark asked, a grin still lingering on his face as he threw another log on the fire. "I swear it sounded like voices." The others stopped what they were doing, all turning their attention to the stream. For a moment, they listened carefully, and sure enough, the water seemed to carry a faint, whispering sound. It was so soft at first that it could easily have been mistaken for the rustling of leaves or the wind blowing through the trees. But as they listened, it became clearer. It was unmistakable. The whispers were calling their names. Sophie, Mark, Ben, come closer. The names echoed through the darkness, each one laced with an eerie undertone. It was as if the very stream was speaking, its voice rising and falling with the flow of water. The sound seemed to surround them, drifting from all sides, but the whispers were always centered around the stream. What the hell? Ben muttered under his breath, his eyes wide as he stared at the dark water. Did you hear that? Yeah, Mark said, his tone serious now. It's like the stream is talking. Sophie's skin prickled. She was sure of it now. It wasn't just the wind. This was something else. The whispers were too clear, too specific. They were calling their names. But what did it want? And why? Maybe it's just the wind, Ben said, shaking his head and standing up. I mean, there's a lot of sound in the woods, right? Branches creaking, animals rustling. Wind doesn't sound like that, Sophie countered, her voice low, but her eyes fixed on the water, as if the stream itself were beckoning her. It's something else. The group fell silent, each person trying to make sense of what was happening. The fire crackled beside them, casting flickering shadows that danced eerily around the campsite. The whispers from the stream grew more distinct, more insistent. Come closer. Sophie, Mark, Ben. The voices seemed to be growing louder now, rising and falling with the water's rhythm, each whisper clear as day. Okay, I'm freaked out now, Ben said, his voice tight with unease. We're all hearing this, right? I'm not losing my mind here. I hear it too, Mark said, his voice strained. It's not normal. Sophie stared at the stream, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know why, but she felt drawn to it. There was something about the water, about the way the voices called to her, that made her want to walk toward it. It was almost as if it was inviting her, as if it knew her in some way, knew something only she could understand. The whispering grew louder, closer, the names almost sounding like they were right next to her ear. Sophie, Sophie, come closer. Mark and Ben exchanged a worried glance. Let's go check it out, Ben suggested, trying to shake off the fear creeping up his spine. I don't know if that's a good idea, Sophie whispered, but her feet were already moving. She wasn't sure why, but she was already walking toward the stream, her body seemingly moving on its own accord. Every step felt like it was pulling her closer to the water, like some invisible force was guiding her. Mark grabbed her arm. Sophie, wait. But Sophie didn't stop. She was too far gone, her mind clouded with the call of the stream, the whispering voices that now filled her head. Sophie, Ben shouted, stepping forward, but his voice faltered as the whispers grew louder, filling his ears, drowning out everything else. Mark, we need to stop her. Mark hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the campfire. It seemed so far away now, the warmth and light of it lost in the cold darkness of the woods. Sophie reached the edge of the stream. The moonlight glinted off the rippling water, and for a moment, she felt a strange calm wash over her, as if everything were as it should be. The whispers were softer now, like a lullaby. "Come closer, Sophie." She leaned in, closer to the water, her reflection dancing on the surface. The stream was calm now, almost too calm, the water still and clear, as if waiting for her. But then, as if something shifted in the air, the whispering turned darker. It no longer sounded inviting. It was harsh, urgent. Come closer, don't stop." The reflection in the water shifted. Sophie's own face stared back at her, but her eyes, were wide, frantic, as though she was trapped inside the water, struggling to get out. She recoiled in horror. The whispers had turned to guttural growls, the water churning violently, as though something beneath the surface was trying to claw its way out. "Sophie, get away from there," Mark shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. Sophie stumbled, her legs weak, and she felt the weight of the water's presence lifting from her chest. The whispers faded, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. She turned to face her friends, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The forest felt too quiet, as though the night itself was holding its breath. "What the hell was that?" Ben breathed, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. I don't know," Sophie whispered, her voice shaking. "It was like it wanted me to come closer, like it was calling me." The stream sound had returned to normal, the gentle murmur of water flowing over rocks, but it felt different now, distant, harmless. No more whispers, no more voices calling their names. The group stood there in silence, eyes darting to the water, half expecting the whispers to return. But the only sound now was the wind, rustling the leaves, and the occasional crack of a branch breaking somewhere deep in the woods. No one spoke. No one dared to. They decided, without another word, to pack up and move to a different part of the campsite, as far away from the stream as possible. But as they walked away, they couldn't shake the feeling that the water, whatever had been calling to them, was still there, watching them from the shadows, waiting for the next group of campers to come. The end. Story 9. The Vanishing Tracks. It was the kind of morning that made you grateful to be alive. The sun had just begun to rise, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. The campsite was still, save for the crackling remnants of the fire from the night before. The group of friends, 5 in total, had spent a peaceful evening under the stars, telling stories and enjoying each other's company. The forest around them was alive with the sounds of morning, birds singing, leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. It was a perfect camping trip, but when they woke up, something was different. It started when Ben, the last to wake up, stepped outside the tent and noticed something strange. There, just beyond the circle of their campsite, the soft morning light revealed a set of footprints in the damp earth. At first glance, it seemed like nothing out of the ordinary. Muddy footprints left behind by someone who had wandered through the woods during the night. They were clear and distinct, the soles of boots leaving an impression in the wet ground. "Hey guys, Ben called, his voice tinged with confusion. "You need to see this." The others slowly emerged from their tents, stretching and yawning. Sophie, the most observant of the group, was the first to notice the tracks as well. "Who do you think they belong to?" she asked, kneeling down to examine the prints. The tracks were odd, though. The footprints were too large for any of them. They weren't anyone from their group. In fact, they seemed to belong to someone who had passed through the campsite in the dead of night, leaving no trace of their presence except for the prints. Maybe someone else camped nearby and left in the night, Mark suggested, but there was a tension in his voice, an undercurrent of unease. "It's strange, though. I didn't hear anyone come by." Sophie nodded. "Same. I didn't hear anything either." They decided to follow the tracks, curious about who might have been near their campsite. As they walked, the prints grew more distinct, leading deeper into the woods. They were heading in the direction of a dense thicket, where the trees grew thick and twisted, blocking much of the morning light. The ground was soft here, muddy from the morning dew, and the footprints were deep, as though the person who had made them was carrying a heavy load. They followed the tracks for what felt like a few hundred yards. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and wildlife strangely absent. The wind had died down, leaving only the sound of their footsteps crunching through the dry leaves. "Maybe we should turn back," Ben said uneasily. "I don't like this. These tracks are too perfect. It doesn't seem right." Sophie glanced back at him, her face pale. "What do you mean?" "I mean, look at them," Ben said, pointing to the prints. "They're too deliberate, like someone's been watching us." "Ben, you're overthinking it," Mark said, rolling his eyes. "We're just following some old tracks. There's nothing strange about it." But as they ventured further, the unease in the group grew. The tracks seemed to be leading them toward a clearing, and that's when they noticed something strange. The footprints, which had been clearly visible up until now, were starting to fade. The deeper they walked into the woods, the less distinct the prints became. At first, it was just the edges that seemed blurred, as if the rain or wind had softened the lines. But then, the footprints began to vanish altogether. "What the hell?" Sophie whispered, halting in her tracks. She pointed down at the ground. There in front of them, the prints simply stopped. One moment, there were clear, deep imprints in the dirt. The next, the earth was smooth and undisturbed, as though no one had ever walked there. Did someone just disappear? Ben asked, his voice barely a whisper. The group stood frozen, staring at the spot where the tracks had ended. The air felt thick, heavy with something unspoken, something that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. It was as if the woods were holding its breath, waiting for them to react. "This doesn't make sense," Mark said, kneeling down to examine the ground more closely. "The tracks were here just a moment ago. How could they just vanish?" Sophie walked around the spot, searching for any sign of disturbance. There was nothing. The ground was untouched, as though the person who had been walking had simply vanished into thin air. "We need to go back to camp," she said finally, her voice trembling. "This isn't right." As they turned to leave, a chill wind picked up, rustling the trees overhead. The once distant sounds of the forest seemed to return, but there was something off about it. The birds were calling, but their cries felt muffled, as though they were far away. The group quickly retraced their steps back to the campsite, their hearts pounding with fear. They didn't speak much on the way back, each of them lost in their own thoughts, trying to make sense of what had just happened. When they reached the campsite, they were met with a strange sight. The campsite itself looked different. It was subtle, but it was enough to make the group pause and take a step back. The fire pit, which had been smoldering when they left, was now completely cold. Their tents, which had been arranged in a neat circle, were slightly displaced, as though someone had moved them during the night. But it was what they found near the fire pit that truly unsettled them. There in the dirt was another set of footprints, but these prints were different. They were larger than the first set, and they were still fresh, still wet with dew, as though someone had just walked over the site. The tracks led away from the fire and toward the tree line, where the trees grew thick and dark. "Someone's been here," Mark said, his voice shaking. "Someone or something." The group stared at the tracks for a long time, none of them daring to move closer. There was no sign of the person who had made them. No rustling in the trees, no movement in the shadows. Just the footprints leading away into the woods. But then, as they watched, the tracks began to fade. Slowly but surely, the prints started to disappear just like the first set had. The ground smoothed over, and the evidence of their presence seemed to vanish as if it had never been there at all. "No," Sophie whispered. "No, this can't be happening." Ben stepped forward cautiously, his heart racing. "We need to leave. Now." Without another word, they packed up their belongings as quickly as they could. The air felt thick, oppressive, and the silence of the woods was deafening. Each of them had the distinct feeling that something was watching them, something just beyond their sight, something that knew they were leaving, knew they were afraid. When they finally made it back to their cars, the sun had fully risen, casting a golden light over the forest. But despite the beauty of the morning, none of them could shake the feeling that the woods had swallowed something that night. Something they weren't meant to find, something that was never meant to be seen. And as they drove away, one last thing happened. In the rearview mirror, they all saw something moving in the trees behind them. A figure, tall and shadowy, watching them leave. The tracks may have vanished, but the memory of them would stay with them forever. The end. Story 10. The fire that wouldn't go out. It was a perfect evening for camping. Cool enough to need a fire, but not too cold to be uncomfortable. A group of 6 friends had chosen a quiet, secluded spot in the woods, far from the usual campgrounds. The air was fresh, the sky clear, and the stars twinkled overhead like a blanket of diamonds. Their campsite sat near the edge of a quiet, slow-moving creek, the gentle sound of water adding to the peaceful ambience. The fire crackled merrily in the center, providing warmth and light, and the group settled around it, enjoying each other's company. Dinner was done, and they spent the evening laughing, telling stories, and roasting marshmallows. As the night wore on, the fire began to dwindle, its orange glow fading into the cool air. By midnight, it was little more than a pile of glowing embers, barely flickering. The group decided it was time to retire for the night. "I'll put the fire out," Sarah offered, reaching for the nearby water bottle. She'd always been the responsible one, making sure everything was properly cleaned up before heading to bed. "Thanks, Sarah," Ben said, stretching out on his sleeping bag. "I'll take the first watch tonight. Keep an eye on the woods." The others began to head to their tents, chatting softly amongst themselves, ready for a good night's rest. Sarah poured water onto the fire, the hiss of steam filling the air as the flames were finally extinguished. The crackling ceased, leaving only the distant sounds of the forest. Sarah looked around at the darkened campsite, feeling a momentary sense of unease. The forest had fallen silent. The usual nighttime sounds of chirping insects and rustling leaves were missing. She shrugged off the feeling, telling herself it was just the quiet of the night settling in. She gave one last glance to the smoldering remnants of the fire and headed to her tent. The others had already made themselves comfortable, the faint sound of their breathing coming from within the tents. The night felt still, too still. Sarah pulled her blanket up and closed her eyes, hoping to fall asleep quickly. But then, a low crackling sound broke the silence, faint at first but growing louder. It sounded like a fire reigniting, the same sharp crackle of wood breaking apart in flames. Sarah's eyes snapped open. Her heart raced. She shot up in her sleeping bag, looking around the tent in the dim light. Was it possible the fire had started again? She unzipped the tent and stepped outside, her feet sinking into the cool earth. Her breath fogged in the cold air as she looked toward the campfire pit. The fire was burning again, but this time it was much larger. The flames flickered wildly, casting long shadows that danced across the surrounding trees. The orange light illuminated the woods, and Sarah could see the flames licking at the dark sky, rising higher than before. It should have been impossible. The fire had been completely out when she went to bed. There was no way it could reignite on its own, not with the amount of water she had poured over it. "Ben," she shouted, running back toward the tents. "Ben, wake up. The fire's back." Ben, who had been keeping watch, sprang to his feet and rushed out of his tent. The others quickly followed, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of the fire. "What the hell?" Ben muttered, his voice tight with confusion and fear. He looked around at the fire, which now seemed unnaturally bright, the flames twisting and writhing in ways that didn't seem right. There was something strange about it, something almost unnatural. "I put it out," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I swear I put it out. I don't know how it's burning again." "We need to put it out again," said James, who had just woken up, his face pale in the firelight. "This is insane. What's going on?" The group scrambled to grab their water bottles and began dousing the flames. The water hissed as it hit the fire, the steam rising in thick clouds. But no matter how much they poured, the fire didn't go out. In fact, it only seemed to grow brighter, the flames licking higher into the night air. "What the hell?" Emma cried, stepping back. "This doesn't make sense. We're putting out a campfire, not summoning a forest inferno." "Wait," Ben said, his voice quiet and tense. "Look." He pointed toward the fire, where something strange was happening. The flames were no longer just flames. They were shifting, twisting into shapes, almost like they were alive. The fire began to take on strange forms, faces, figures, shadows that seemed to move within the blaze. The flickering light cast eerie silhouettes that looked too real, too human. "Okay, this is getting weird," Sarah said, stepping back. "I don't know what this is, but I don't like it. Let's just get out of here," James said, his voice trembling. "This can't be happening." But as they turned to leave, something impossible happened. The fire flared up again, and the sound of the crackling grew louder, almost deafening. It was as if the fire was calling to them, pulling them back. And then, as if by some unseen force, the flames leapt higher and higher, consuming the surrounding trees and bushes. They could feel the heat now, the oppressive weight of it pressing against their skin, the air thick with smoke. Ben grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her away from the fire. "Run," he shouted. The group scattered, their hearts pounding as they fled into the woods. The fire chased them, its flames flashing in the distance, always staying just behind them. They ran as fast as they could, their feet stumbling over roots and rocks. But the fire never seemed to stop. It kept coming, always growing larger, always burning brighter, as though something or someone was feeding it. They finally reached the edge of the woods, out of breath, shaking with fear. The fire had stopped at the tree line, burning just on the outskirts of the forest. But it wasn't over. The group stood in stunned silence, staring back at the camp. And then, as if it had been nothing more than a dream, the fire suddenly disappeared. The bright, flickering flames vanished into the night, leaving only the faint glow of embers that slowly faded into the darkness. "What just happened?" Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. "How did it stop?" They stood there for a long time, too afraid to move, too afraid to look back at the campsite. It was as though the fire had never been there at all, as though the flames had been some trick of the mind. But they all knew it hadn't been. They had seen it with their own eyes. The night was silent once more, but the tension in the air remained. "Let's get out of here," Ben said after a long pause. "Before it starts again." The group packed up in a hurry, their hands shaking as they gathered their belongings. They didn't speak much as they packed, each person lost in their own thoughts, too unsettled to make sense of what had happened. They knew one thing for sure, though. Whatever it was, it hadn't been a normal fire. It hadn't been something they could control. As they made their way back to the cars, the forest behind them was still and quiet. The fire that wouldn't go out had finally gone, but it had left behind a lingering sense of dread, a feeling that something in those woods was watching, waiting for the moment to return. The end